Okay, I think at this point of the discussion, it might actually be a good moment to broaden the historical scope of what you just have introduced as geoeconomics, since in your book you suggest a periodization of these very geoeconomics. So you trace a trajectory from the 1970s energy crisis that you've just mentioned, when third world resource nationalism had peaked and global north energy security strategies took shape, to Biden's push for green industrial dominance, which institutionalizes supply chain security through onshoring and demanufacturing incentives. So could you maybe walk us through these four key moments that you identify in your periodization? So the 70s energy crisis, the 2008 financial crisis and the commodity boom, Trump's geoeconomic turn in 2016, and finally Biden's green industrial push in 2020. So in what ways do these moments reveal continuities and ruptures in geoeconomic strategy?
Yes, it's a great question, and it's actually in a way causing me to rethink some things, the way that you've posed it. The scholars that I borrow the term geoeconomics from, it's not my own coinage at all, have a more stadial or stagist kind of understanding of recent economic history, in which neoliberalism was predominant or hegemonic from, let's say, the 70s through the 2010s. And then at a certain moment, and we could split hairs about when it happened, but geoeconomics becomes the prevailing kind of discourse and policy approach, prevailing kind of thought world even more broadly of powerful actors in the current global economy, right? So first neoliberalism, then geoeconomics, right? And the way in which neoliberalism and geoeconomics are distinct from one another is clear enough if we have very kind of, how shall I say it, like very pure versions, ideal type, that's the word I'm looking for, ideal typical understandings of a neoliberal world order of like free trade and capital mobility. And not that states aren't there, but their main goal is to facilitate the movement and accumulation of capital, right? Or to protect property vis-a-vis other social demands, right? You know, in Quinn Slobodian's rendering, to kind of protect markets from democracy, right? So the state can be quite muscular, but the state is oriented to facilitating capital, right? Whereas in a geoeconomic order, there's this deep imbrication of security, strategic, geostrategic imperatives of the state that are kind of viewed as somewhat external to the operations of capital. Those get kind of imbricated, and the state starts shaping capital accumulation and movement, or lack thereof, you know, trying to maybe stop so much movement of capital and keep it within your borders, right? According to geoeconomic imperatives, right? Or geopolitical imperatives, we can say, right? So there's this stagist idea. What I want to actually argue, and your question is prompting me to argue this, maybe clarifying it to me for the first time, is that I'm not totally satisfied with that stagism. I think it ignores some of the really prevalent security discourses and policies in the period of high neoliberalism, just as it might encourage us too much to kind of discard with neoliberalism in the present as a concept that's still relevant, might maybe trick us into like we're in a totally post-neoliberal moment, right? So on either side of this divide, I think it's actually, there's a lot more threads and continuities, right, than a stadial understanding would maybe suggest. And so when we go to what's often taken as the proximate origin point for what we call neoliberalism, and we often trace that to the 70s. Of course, there's an interwar, there's an earlier history of even the term neoliberalism. I'll leave that to the historians, right? But in the 70s is when, you know, we see major implementation of policies that we tend to call neoliberalism. And we actually see them across the global south and north. In fact, of course, Chile is a key laboratory for this, as is, you know, the Eastern Bloc or whatever, right? And then, of course, Thatcher and Reagan, and I don't need to walk us through all of this, but in the 80s, you know, picking up in the 80s. But the 70s, you know, has another association with it, which is the energy crisis, right? And so at the same time that we're seeing the beginnings of what we now call neoliberal policies and neoliberal hegemony, we're also in a moment of profound crisis in the very materiality of the capitalist economy, which is the flows of oil, which are the lifeblood. You know, I take that from Matt Huber, the lifeblood of the global system, right? And so it's a moment in which, as you put it yourself, where we have basically a battle over the kind of who gets to control and who gets to benefit from and who pays the cost of the kind of global resource economy, with oil being at its center. But there were also battles over mining and other related extractive sectors as well at the same time. And what we saw was a kind of empowerment and a kind of confidence and assertiveness of global South, what we would call third world at the time and non-aligned at the time, right? Governments, and this took the form of OPEC, this took the form of nationalizations, right? A real assertiveness, which was met, not unsurprisingly, like with a real backlash from the global North, but not just a backlash in the form of military coups or attempting to kind of undercut these resource nationalist experiments, but also, as we discussed earlier, in terms of, well, let's build some of our own internal resource security, right? So then we get the expanding extractive or fossil frontier, within the global North, right? So that 70s moment is so pivotal, not just because it's like, oh, just, another moment where we see these contests over global resources and extraction, but it literally like birthed the logics and the languages of dependency, understood as a critical concept on the part of the third world. Like, we want to get away from the trap of dependency. That means we need sovereignty, we need assertiveness, we need nationalization, and then dependency with a very different valence on the global North side, right? So I think that it's, it's the intimate entanglement of colonizer and colonized. You can even see that in the word choices, right? And so dependency for the global North wasn't, oh, we're dependent to the dictates of capitalists elsewhere, of governments elsewhere, but that we depend on our former colonies for their resources, right? We actually fundamentally depend on them. And once that spigot is cut off, or it's rechanneled, or the terms of access are increased, the barriers to our access, then we start to get worried, right? And then we start to talk about, early versions of onshoring and securitization and things like this, right? So the 70s create a legacy that, is kind of, in certain ways, providing some of the concepts and analyses that are relevant again in our moment, right? Each of these moments, and I won't go through them in the same detail, but in 2008, you had another real reckoning for the way that extraction took place, because we had a commodity boom that was really driven by China's industrialization as well as by the other emerging economies. And so the prices of copper, soy, beef, everything, oil went through the roof. And that really scared, I won't curse on this video, but I was going to say scared the shit out of, but scared very much so, like the global North policymakers who were like, we can't rely on this cheap copper, beef, and soil. And not only, are the prices high for imports that are important to us, but also they're high because there's an ascendant other economic power, which is China. Yeah. Not only is China ascendant, but we're in our worst financial crisis ever, which is itself not unrelated to China's ascendancy, because one reason among many for China's concerted industrial policy was actually seeing the West in shambles, the financial system in shambles, and saying, okay, we got to kind of do this ourselves, right? And so on both sides of the sort of Western China divide, the financial crisis and the commodity boom were key reasons, for this turn towards like, okay, we need secure supply chains. Now, in China, that proceeded apace, and they have continued to securitize their supply chains quite successfully, you might say. In the West, there wasn't quite the political opening for it yet. Yeah. Like the ideas of secure supply chains and critical minerals and like we need to onshore this date to that crisis moment, but they didn't have their political opening until the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a variety of geopolitical conflagrations, which provided political opening. And the other thing that gave political opening too for these ideas of industrial policy and supply chain security and all of that was the right-wing populist backlash represented by Trump, right, which spoke about bringing manufacturing back home. And then what's the liberal response to that? The liberal response is to actually orient towards that, is to mutate towards that, is to not say, no, let's defend free trade. Like, that's actually, interestingly, not the liberal response. They realize that there is no longer quite that political constituency for like a free trade globalization, and for various reasons that I'll leave it to your other interview subjects to get into. But it's a clear, reckoning moment for liberals, and the way that they deal with this is by, and this speaks to almost where our last question ended, but is by kind of preserving some of this economic nationalism, ratifying it is what I mean to say. The economic nationalism, the supply chain security, a lot of the specific dictates of that Trump, the first Trump government, and green it, or like, and high tech it, and sort of make it less about just this like brash, like we're gonna bring stuff home and say, in order to fulfill our green objectives, in order to have the best semiconductor industry, in order to be at the scientific vanguard or the vanguard of even like human progress, I mean, you get these really big statements by liberals, we need supply chain security. But the kind of way that you securitize supply chains are like show the legacy of the 70s, show this continuity from Trump to Biden, right? And so you see these and have also these ideas that were first formulated during the commodity boom. So I don't want to downplay, ruptures and real changes. Each of these are ruptures, but what happens on the other side of the rupture is not like a black and white change. It is the kind of reconfiguration of elements and policy elements and discursive elements from the prior kind of regime, their reconfiguration to new ends. And so we see a kind of layered, sedimented process of historical change in which things are escalating, but they're escalating based on foundations and plateaus that are kind of like consolidated and sedimented at each prior moment. And so I think it just gives us a more sense of historical logic to these developments, and they're less kind of out of the blue.
And the architect or the main protagonist of the Biden security endorsement was probably Jake Sullivan, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, right. And so, we have these kind of actors that are at the border between security policy and economic policy and themselves blurring that border. I want to just say one other quick thing here, because my answer there was quite global north centric, aside from the mention of China, which is just that what we also see today is a return, and it's not always the best term, but I don't want to, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but like we see some kind of renewed interest in resource nationalism in the global south. And these, again, are related to one another, right? We see kind of just overall kind of like politicization of these supply chains, which is kind of making salient again strategies that, as I said, kind of first gelled in the 1970s.